Michelangelo did not have a big track record as a painter himself. So putting him in charge of a massive project to fresco the ceiling of the most prestigious chapel in the Papal Palace was quite a gamble.
Welcome to the History Extra Podcast. Fascinating historical conversations from the makers of BBC History Magazine.
From his famed statue of David to the extraordinary paintings that adorn the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, Michelangelo's work still inspires awe. In today's Life of the Week episode, Professor Catherine Fletcher speaks to Rachel Dinning about the life and legacy of the Renaissance sculptor, painter, architect and poet.
Thanks so much for joining me on the History Extra podcast today, Catherine. It's great to have you.
It's great to be back. Thank you.
Today, we're going to be talking about the life and legacy of the sculptor, painter, architect and poet Michelangelo. So to kick us off today, Catherine, why is Michelangelo considered one of the greatest artists of the Renaissance?
I think some of it is about the fact that he can work across these different media. I mean, you just said painting, sculpture, architecture, but, as well as the poetry. But if you think about just how iconic those things are, painting, we've got the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, that famous, fingers touching of God and Adam. With the sculpture, we've got the David, which is really the iconic symbol in Florence. And then with the architecture, you're back in Rome again, the Dome of St. Peter's, where he made such an important contribution to that massive project. And trying to think of anybody else who really has a comparable reputation other than Leonardo da Vinci. And I think the two of them are really the great sort of polymaths, if you like, of this period. It's hard to find somebody who matches Michelangelo just in terms of the iconic legacy.
And we'll get on to talking about some of those works you've just mentioned in a bit more detail later on in the podcast. But I thought, firstly, we could go back to the beginning of his story. So what can you tell us about Michelangelo's early life?
So he was born in 1475 near Florence. His family were from Florence. They were actually living outside at the time of his birth, nearer to the town of Arezzo in a place called Caprese. And his father was a sort of small-time banker who also worked as a government official. Michelangelo, though, had quite a turbulent childhood. So his mother died when he was 6, and he spent some of his early life, in fact, in the care of a nanny, living near a marble quarry that his father owned up in Settignano, which is a village in the hills outside Florence. So if you've ever been to Florence, you'll know the city itself is sort of down in a basin by the river. And there are all these hills around where people have these lovely villas. The wealthy people of the city used to go out. But the marble quarry story is really interesting because, here you have somebody who becomes this great sculptor in marble and yet has grown up as a child in that environment, seeing the stone being cut and dug every day. So, great start to the future life. And although the family are having a little bit of a hard time on the banking side, clearly they're not completely broke because Michelangelo gets to go to school in Florence, to grammar school where he's studying Latin, he's studying, the liberal arts, the classics. And from there, really starts to pick up some of his interest in art. I mean, there's a story that he's more interested in going around the Florentine churches, looking at the amazing artworks that are there, painted by people like Botticelli and Ghirlandaio and so forth. And, he's really positioned there in a way for his career to take off.
You mentioned there that he started to develop his interests very, very early on. How did he develop his skills in these fields?
So when he was 13, he was apprenticed to really one of the leading Florentine painters of the day, Domenico Ghirlandaio, who was involved already in painting the walls of the Sistine Chapel in Rome. So that gives you a sense of, what a prominent artist he was. And very, very quickly, within Ghirlandaio's workshop, Michelangelo comes to prominence. In fact, unusually for an apprentice, he starts getting paid. His father says, this guy is so good, you should be paying him. I mean, only a year into the apprenticeship. And by the age of 15, he has been sort of handpicked to go into the Medici Academy. So the Medici at this time are the main ruling family in Florence. The person in charge is called Lorenzo the Magnificent. He isn't officially the Lord or the Duke of the city, and this is important because it's going to become a matter of contention later on in Michelangelo's career, this relationship with the Medici. But the Medici are massive patrons of art, really important in creating this cultural environment in Florence. And so Michelangelo goes off to their academy to, study more generally, study philosophy, study the humanities, but also to start sculpting. And while he's still in his teens, working for the Medici, he sculpts 2 amazing early sculptures. And these are the kind of relief works. So they're they're kind of marble panels rather than fully 3-dimensional. And these are the Madonna of the Steps and the Battle of the Centaurs. Perhaps somewhat, again, inspired both by Christianity, but also by classical art.
So his skill really, really there from an early age.
Absolutely.
I wanted to talk about one of his most famous works that our listeners will surely be familiar with. So this is the statue of the biblical figure David, which was originally commissioned as part of a series of statues intended for the Florence Cathedral. So can you tell us a bit about the story of how Michelangelo came to work on this statue?
Yeah, the David comes at a really interesting point in Florentine history. So at this point, the Medici have been exiled from Florence. Lorenzo de' Medici, the great patron, is dead. There's been quite a radical religious regime. And Michelangelo comes back to Florence, having been in Rome, to work on this project of David. Now, the David has been planned, or some kind of sculpture has been planned for almost 40 years at this point. This huge block of marble has been lying around. It's been worked on a bit. It's sitting there in the cathedral works department, and they're trying to find somebody to do something with it. So Michelangelo comes in, having sculpted in Rome an incredible statue called the Pietà, which you can still see in St. Peter's in Rome, having made his reputation somewhat with that statue. And he gets the job. And, the way he works on sculpture is really, very precise. He does a lot of preliminary work. He draws a lot of sketches. You might sometimes see in exhibitions a lot of drawings by Michelangelo. So this is not something where you're just diving in and sculpting directly. There's a lot of drawing in advance. There's a lot of planning with models in advance. And then eventually, he's even making his own tools, because he's so, keen to get it absolutely right that he won't even, he's not going to go into a shop and buy a chisel. He is going to sort out his own tools to do the sculpting. So he gets to work, and they build this huge sort of scaffolding up this marble block, and he turns out this absolutely stunning sculpture. And of course, it's too heavy to go on the roof where it was meant to go. So they then have an argument about where they're going to put it and the appropriate place of honour in the main cathedral square, which I think is quite fun.
So I went to see David a couple of years ago, and the first thing that struck me when I looked at it was how big the hands are. And I think this is something lots of people notice. So can you tell us why Michelangelo, who's, he's almost an expert in human anatomy, why did he make the hands so big?
The idea with some of these sculptures, and some of them are more sort of realistic than others, is not so much that he's showing a real life figure, more that he's showing an ideal figure. And this is connected to sort of ideas around Neoplatonism that he's learned in the Medici Academy. So it's very much as a part of the philosophy of his time. But I think, obviously, in some senses, yes, he wants to do very precise anatomy. He is very keen on showing human expression. But sometimes he also wants to emphasize what is important and to show us something that perhaps isn't quite real. And one of the, really fascinating things about his art is that sometimes he shows these figures in impossible positions, and yet they look as if they could really be doing that. And that's also very fascinating, that you can make something appear real even when it isn't. So it works in both directions.
Absolutely. He also looks, when I saw him, as if he'd just walk off the platform and and start speaking to you. It's like so much life behind him. On that note, why is the statue of David so famous? Why is it such a tourist attraction today? Why, of all his works, is that one of the the most well-known ones?
Well, it was very important in the iconography of Florence at the time, and it's very symbolic for the city because what it represents is the city's liberty. So this is from the biblical myth of David against Goliath, and this is the small city of Florence holding out against the giant tyrants. Now, in the political context, you can see this actually as a critique of the Medici and their foreign backers, because they're the tyrants who want to come and take over the city. So the David, I think, initially starts off as something of a symbol of freedom and liberty and of the Republic. And of course, later on in history, as lots of other, countries around the world through the centuries fight for freedom and liberty and for their own republics against the monarchy, this example of Florence and its fight for liberty back, against the Medici in the 15th century, symbolized by this incredible artwork, has a real political importance. So I think, some of it is that, and some of it is also that it's just, it's an amazing statue. And it's about the ability to turn, a raw block of marble into that incredible work without cracking it, without flaws, all the rest of it. It's just the sheer quality of the art alongside that political significance that I think gives it its iconic nature.
So you mentioned there its significance politically, and you also said earlier about Michelangelo's relationship with the Medici. Could you tell us a bit more about that? What did he think of them?
Well, essentially, although he took Medici patronage quite a bit over the years, he was not really on the side of the Medici against the people in Florence who wanted a relatively broader-based government. I mean, nobody at this time was calling for democracy. Nobody was calling even for all-male suffrage, but there was an argument about how many of the men of the city should be involved in government and whether or not it should be this republic that, in some sense, the David represents, or whether, as it eventually became after 1532, it should be a duchy with just the Medici running a hereditary line of rulership. So Michelangelo has these really quite tense relationships with the Medici to the point that in the last republic, in 1529, he ends up being the person in charge of fortification for the opponents of the Medici, reinforcing the city walls against the artillery that are besieging it, which is basically Spanish artillery backed, supporting the re-entry of the Medici. And there's a point, there's a point when he's really quite fearful about what's going to happen to him. And if you go to Florence, there's a room that's called Michelangelo's secret room, which is allegedly where he sort of holed up after the Medici came back to power in 1530 and hid away and sort of graffitied these sketches on the walls inside the Basilica of San Lorenzo, what's now the Medici Chapel. Now, there's a bit of debate about whether the sketches are actually his or not. But the fact that story exists, I think, tells you something about how worried he was about Medici power versus his own politics. And eventually he does come back to do a bit more work for the Medici, but only because he has a very good personal relationship with Giulio de' Medici, who is Pope Clement VII, Pope who is probably best known here for refusing Henry VIII his divorce, but that's a whole other story. It's interesting to see how these people all overlap in different bits of history. But yeah, Clement VII and Michelangelo have a good enough personal relationship to override some of the political tensions in the early 1530s. But after doing that last bit of work on these tombs that are in the Medici chapels, the night and day sculptures, absolutely beautiful tomb monument, Michelangelo never works for the Medici again.
Now, it's said that Michelangelo considered himself primarily a sculptor. What would you say?
Well, I think it's certainly what he's known for, and it's what he does most of early on. And this is why I think when he got the commission to do the Sistine Chapel ceiling in 1508, it was a little bit of a surprise to people, because that was quite a risky decision. Although he had been apprenticed to Ghirlandaio, who's primarily known as a painter, Michelangelo did not have a big track record as a painter himself. So putting him in charge of a massive project to fresco the ceiling of the most prestigious chapel in the Papal Palace was quite a gamble. So, yeah, I think that, if you look at the works through the years that perhaps have long-lasting influence, some of them are, I think, the sculptures. But equally, the one that so many people will recognize is the ceiling, and then later on in the same place, the Last Judgment. So he does these two sort of sets of frescoes for the Sistine Chapel, pretty much generation apart, one between 1508 and 1512, and then the Last Judgment in the 1540s. So they're really different stages of his work. But yeah, it's very interesting to think that for him, those were perhaps not the priority. He had a very, very tough time with the Sistine Chapel ceiling. I mean, he just sort of describes himself coming out of that project as sort of being bent like a bow, like a kind of archery bow. And yeah, it does seem to be a very, very tough piece of work to do.
I mean, this was one of my questions. How on earth do you approach painting the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel? What were the practicalities of that?
Well, a lot of scaffolding, but also a lot of preparation. There is some debate about how much assistance Michelangelo had on the project. So in one of the documents, we get the sense that he actually did hire in 12 assistants who were going to work on it. But then there's a question of what he actually allowed his assistants to do, because he was a bit of a kind of micromanager. According to one historian who's written extensively on his life, he really tended to come in and take over and not really let his assistants do nearly as much as an assistant would typically do in a Florentine workshop. So although in theory he was managing a team, it's only in his very, very late projects, when he's personally not really physically capable of doing so much himself anymore, that he has to let go and he has to allow the assistants to work. But with the Sistine Chapel, one of the theories at least is that he is really restricting what they do and taking over and just doing the work himself, getting up there, lying on his back, painting the ceiling. And it's quite an extraordinary piece of work. And, the ability to work through all those details of perspective, so that when you go in today and you look up at the ceiling, it appears in the stunning way that it does. It is genuinely extraordinary.
I wanted to ask a bit more about his personal life. You've touched on the idea that he was a little bit of a micromanager. He was a bit controlling when it came to his work. But what else do we know about Michelangelo's character?
Well, he had a wide reputation for being quite difficult to get on with. He got into a physical fight when he got his nose broken by another artist, a sculptor called Torrigiano, when he was quite young, over a rivalry. He didn't really speak to Raphael, who was his contemporary working at the papal court. There's sort of one story of an encounter where they exchange insults. And I think Michelangelo says Raphael looks like he's kind of walking around with the police guard, and Raphael says Michelangelo looks like he's going about like an executioner because he's always on his own, in the same way that nobody speaks to the executioner. And I mean, to what extent these things are true, we can't really say. But I think there's an indication that a lot of people found him difficult to get on with. Leo X, the first of the Medici popes, sort of said, this guy's terrible, I can't work with him. As I say, it was Leo's cousin Giulio who seems to have found a bit of an easier working relationship with Michelangelo. So, he's difficult. He doesn't, until quite a lot later in his life, have a kind of an individual person who he's at all romantically connected with. Later on, we know that he from his poetry, in fact, that he wrote a really extensive sequence of sonnets to a much younger man, sort of 30 or so years his junior, Tommaso de Cavalieri. Now, as with any historic same-sex relationship, people always ask the question of, were they actually a couple? Were they just friends? We never ask that question in quite the same way about straight people. And I think that, that again is a little bit of an open question, because certain people in Michelangelo's religious circle at that time did go in for celibacy and personal, abstention from sexual relationships. But, the sonnets are very erotic and people speculate all sorts. Who knows? But I think, the idea that his primary sexual orientation was towards men is probably about right.
Mm-hmm. And we know that he never married or had children, right?
Yeah, and he has good relations with some of his family. He corresponds with his nephew and so forth. So he's got some family there, but quite often it feels like quite at a distance. And he's a bit, we do get this sense that certainly for a lot of his life, he's a bit of a loner. He's doing his own thing. He's, somewhat solitary as an individual.
Now, we know him mostly for his paintings and his sculptures, but he did so much more than that. What can you tell us about other works that he completed that are worth knowing about?
Well, I think the big one is the Dome of St. Peter's. Now, this is a really big project. I mean, it's a mega project. It takes over a century from when people first start talking about getting a new dome, a complete rebuilding of St. Peter's, which at the beginning of the 16th century is falling apart, to the point and into the 17th century when we actually have the finished basilica that we know today. And Michelangelo plays a very, very important role in that round about the middle of the 16th century. So in the later years of his life, really in coming in and fixing a project that was going horribly wrong because the engineering had not been done correctly. And there's a great book called God's Architect where William Wallace goes through and just sort of explains how Michelangelo has to strip back some of the previous work out what's gone wrong, and actually sort of sort out the engineering detail to get this dome to a stage where it isn't going to fall down, where we've got the kind of the foundations to build that extraordinary huge dome that now dominates the skyline of Rome. And I think, this sort of brings me back to this point about Michelangelo's ability to work in these different media. I mean, okay, you could not just paint the Sistine Chapel ceiling and sculpt marble incredibly on your own. You could also sort out an enormous engineering and architectural project, which I think is sort of testament to some of his skill there.
And how was his work received at the time? Was he well known? Was he sort of a celebrity of his day? I know it's a very different thing back then.
Well, in the founding text of art history, which was written by Giorgio Vasari in Michelangelo's lifetime, he was the only living painter and artist to feature in the first edition. Now, that's possibly partly because Vasari was a little bit of a partial to Florentine and Tuscan artists above anybody else. And in the second edition, he did add in Titian, who, of course, a very famous contemporary Venetian painter. But I think the fact that in the whole history of art, as first composed, you're the only living painter who makes it, says something about his reputation at the time. He really, really was very much in demand for these enormous projects.
Now, what can you tell us about the end of Michelangelo's life? Like, where did he die? Where's he buried? That kind of thing.
So Michelangelo died when he was very elderly. He was 88. Obviously, he spent a lot of those last years working on the St. Peter's project. And he was buried, though, not in Rome, where he'd been doing most of his work, but in Florence. And specifically in the Basilica of Santa Croce. And Santa Croce is really interesting because it's almost like a pantheon of famous Florentine and Italian people. So Machiavelli has a big monument there, so does Dante. So after Michelangelo will Galileo, more modern figures like the composer Rossini, the inventor of radio, Marconi. So he's part of that monument to the great men. It is primarily men of Italy. So there he is back in his home city of Florence, which I think also says something about his attachment to Florence, even despite the fact that for much of his later life, he didn't live there.
As we enter the end of the podcast now, is there anything that we haven't talked about so far that we should know about Michelangelo?
One of the things that really fascinates me, given all his work in the Sistine Chapel and in St. Peter's Basilica, is the fact that Michelangelo was actually part of some of the most critical people within the Catholic Church and the closest to Protestantism. So this is obviously the 16th century. It's the time of the Reformation, enormous religious fervour after Martin Luther's challenge to the Catholic Church, breakaway of Henry VIII, Church of England, of many German princes. And Michelangelo was part of a circle of people, some of whom came very close to being tried for heresy, because they subscribed, without ever leaving the Catholic Church, to a lot of beliefs that were very close to Protestantism, some of which we see in Michelangelo's own sculptures. For example, he made a sculpture of a biblical figure called Nicodemus, who was somebody who, in the text, conceals his own religious beliefs. So I think that's quite an extraordinary part of his story. And the other thing that I think is really more quite fun as an aspect of Michelangelo's story is just the response to the Last Judgment. Michelangelo started the Last Judgment, again, in this period where people weren't quite sure how to be responding to Protestants and how the Catholic Church should respond. And he produces this incredible but very naked painting of the Last Judgment. And by the time it's finished, people are starting to think, we need to get a little bit tougher and more moral in our religious art. And having all these nudes on the wall of Sistine Chapel really isn't it. And there's quite a lot of criticism, and eventually to the point where somebody gets paid to cover them all up. So we only know what Michelangelo's original, rather naked Last Judgment looks like because one cardinal thought, no, this is worth saving. I'm going to get another artist to make a copy. So we have the copy of the original, but what we see today is actually the cover-up, the slightly, more tasteful, family-friendly version of the original. And I think that's, is just fascinating the way that fresco, sits in the context of that dramatic change in religious attitudes around that mid-century period.
We've got a censored version of it that wasn't even his original piece. Big question now as we wrap this up. What is, in your words, Michelangelo's legacy in art history?
I think it's not necessarily the most famous stuff. So there's a sort of public legacy, which are the things that we all know, which are the pointing finger of God and the David and so forth. But actually what often influences subsequent sculptures are these very sort of twisting figures. This revival of things that have been done in classical sculpture, have been done previously, but it's the almost the movement of some of these figures. The idea, you can perhaps see it in the figures of the Last Judgment, that people are writhing, they're almost kind of caught in a very specific moment when they're moving. And that's very influential on subsequent developments in art in the school of mannerism. And that's true both of the paintings. So we can see in the Last Judgment figures when people kind of falling down to hell, but we could also see it in sculpture. And I think that's very important as a contribution that goes on to influence other artists, even if to some extent the sculptures are not so well known as the iconic David.